the delay. Parrots, I guess you could hear me. Thank you. Okay, sorry for that delay. Just came back from Lakewood, so I'm a little backed up. Okay, so we'll continue with Muktza, but before we do that, it was requested by one of the members of this Chavura of the Shir that we should discuss, because this week coming up is the holidays. So a lot of questions are being asked about presents for cleaning ladies, for coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, maybe we'll discuss that for a little bit. I think I don't have the assistant on tonight. So I guess just post questions if you want me to discuss anything specific about this, or you want me to stop discussing it, we do that too. Or whatever it is, just post whatever you want. Again, I forgot to say, Leilin Mishma is Leilin Nishmas, Yehuda Shimon Zichron L'Rocha ben Yeshua Yosef Moshe, and Aryalev Zichron L'Rocha ben Yeshua Adam Zalman. Their neshamas should have an aliyah, even though their neshamas probably don't need an aliyah, but they should have an aliyah anyways. It should be a schus for them and for us too. Okay, so basically, there's two issues with giving a present to a guy. There's a pasuk that says, "Lo sechanim," don't give anything free to a non-Jew. Don't give anything free. You're not allowed to give. It could be even an issur from the Torah to give something free to a non-Jew. So the question is it ever allowed? Is one ever allowed to give something free to a non-Jew? So basically, what the poskim say is that giving something free means free, that there's no reason for you to give it to them, and you're not going to gain anything from giving it to them. Meaning, if you just walk over to a random non-Jew and say, "Here, this is for you," so that would not be allowed, because that's giving something free to that's giving something free to a guy, right? But if you can gain something from it, then it's allowed. So a cleaning lady, if you're giving her a tip because then she'll work better for you, or she'll help out others, etc., and that's 100% mutter all year round. Giving a tip for a restaurant is also okay, because that's considered part of the salary, and you also hope that they'll treat you better. They'll treat you better next time, and those type of things. The question becomes, if you, let's say, buy something that by mistake is not kosher, can you give that? Can you give that to somebody? So again, it would have to be for somebody who you're gaining something from. So giving a cleaning lady would be okay, because you're going to gain something from it. But just to walk over to a random guy, then that's not really allowed. Now, I don't know how it plays out with making a kiddush Hashem, right? If you go over to a random non-Jew, a random guy in the street, and give him something, so then maybe that's like a kiddush Hashem, so you're getting something out of it. But it's debatable. It's debatable whether that's really mutter. Okay, so in most scenarios, there's something to be gained by giving the non-Jew a present, so therefore it would be allowed. How about for the holidays? So the holidays, there's an interesting halacha when it comes to Yom Tovim, not Yom Chaz Shalom, not their holidays, right? Their holidays. Where not only you're not allowed to give them presents by their holidays, but the Gemara says you're not even allowed to do business with them, not 3 days before the holiday, and not 3 days after the holiday, because since they're feeling in a religious mood when by these holidays, if you're going to give them money or give them business, then they're going to go praise their God, and by praising their God, they're going to be over avodah zarah. Okay, so what do we care if a guy is over avodah zarah? A guy is not allowed to be over avodah zarah. So we're going to be over on the issur of lifnei iver lasita mishal. It's an interesting thing that many people don't realize, that you can actually be over on an issur daraisa for causing a guy to be over on an issur that they're not allowed to do. All right, for example, the guy is not allowed to steal. So if you cause a guy to steal, then you could be over an Issa Daraisa because a guy might do an Isser. So a guy is not allowed to do Avodah Zarah. Since a guy is not allowed to do Avodah Zarah, you can't do anything that's going to facilitate them doing Avodah Zarah, which they may do around the holiday. So that's the way the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says it, and that's the way it's really passed in the Shulchan Aruch, that 3 days before and 3 days after, really you can't do it. However, and the Chachamim don't do this often, so that's why it's an interesting din, especially when you compare it to the way we learn Muktza, where a lot of the Gezeras seemingly shouldn't really apply anymore, but we stick with them anyways, because once a Chacham make a Gezerah, they make a Gezerah. But by this case of giving holiday presents, we basically say that nowadays they're not really Avodah Zarah, the Goyim. I mean, how many Goyim really actually even go to their base of Avodah Zarahs ever? Even when they go, they don't even know what they're doing. Maybe they're just going to, talk to the galach, to the priest, whatever it is. They're not really doing much. They're not really doing much more than that. And I mean, the holiday season for them is just a party. It's just a way to do business and to excuse to give presents, etc., etc. So really, nowadays, there's no real concern that if you would give a guy a present around the holiday season, they're going to go thank their Avodah Zarah. So therefore, nowadays we paskin that it is allowed. You are allowed to give them even around this season, even 3 days before and even 3 days after. However, the paskin say that you should really try not to give the present the day before. I think it's next Shabbos, right? So try not to give it on that day, which shouldn't be too difficult this year because it's Shabbos. Try not to give it that day or the day before. I tell people to just do it now, do it like a week before or a week after. A week after might be a little too late, but do it, a bunch of days before, so it's not glaring that you're doing it for their holiday, and then you're okay, right? This also applies to people tip their mailman, if people tip the garbage man. So if you do it around now, you just say happy holidays. So everybody knows that it's Hanukkah time, it's around Hanukkah time, and the Arabs have their thing. Everybody's getting in on this marketing thing called the holidays. So therefore, we can be lenient and do it, just not during the actual holiday. Okay, so that's basically that halacha. If anybody has any questions on that, if you don't mind posting it now, otherwise we'll move back to Muktza. Or I guess later, if you have any questions, we can address it again. Fine. Okay, so I don't see any questions. So we'll move back to Muktza. So this again, the subject that we started last week with buses, and we'll go over it again just because it's actually an important, I mean, not all of Hilchos Muktza is important, but it's important because it comes up a lot, this buses. Buses again means a base, which is that if something Muktza is sitting on top of something that's not Muktza, then that item will, the item that's not Muktza, that's holding on to something that's Muktza, is going to be considered considered Muktza. Your classic example would be if you have a leichter, a candelabra on top of a table. So now that table will, because the candelabra is Muktza, so therefore that table now becomes Muktza, and you're not allowed to move that table. Even if you remove the candelabra from the table, you would not be allowed to move that table anymore on Shabbos, because it's what we call a basis, right? So that's a basis l'davar ha'asar. So now we'll go through again the criteria of there's a bunch of things that you have to meet in order for it to be, and you have to meet all of them in order for it to be a basis. So, but if that happens, then you're really stuck not moving your tables, And it could be applicable to drawers in the kitchen. With a lot of times you have drawers that have Muktza and all these type of things. So we'll try and get this clear and finish this part of the Muktza tonight. So again, this is called Basis L'Davar Asar. And again, the item that is holding onto the Muktza will itself become Muktza even once the item is removed. Okay, but there's a bunch of qualifications, and you have to meet every single one of these qualifications. If it's even missing one of these qualifications, then it's not going to be a basis. Okay, so first is it has to be put there purposely. Okay, it has to be on the item that's Muktza purposely. Meaning, if you left a hammer, or let's go with the candelabra on the table, you put it there on purpose. That's why you lit it there. So therefore, the table gets the status of the Muktza. If you didn't plan on putting the candelabra on the table, and you just kept it there by mistake, so if it's there by mistake, then the table is not going to be considered Muktza. The candelabra obviously is Muktza. The table is not Muktza. So again, first one is that it has to be put there on purpose. Second is that it has to be done by the owner of the house, not by some random person. If somebody comes to my house and leaves a wallet on my table, so we're not going to say that the table now cannot be moved because there was a wallet on it and the table was holding onto the wallet, because that person had no right to put the wallet on my table. So therefore, the table will not be Muktza, because again, it has to be done by the person who owns the property, right, or the table. Okay. Then we said that the table has to be serving the Muktza, not the Muktza serving the table. An example of that would be if you had something Muktza sitting on top of papers, so that the papers don't fly away. So now you have papers which are not Muktza. Obviously, we're referring to papers that are not Muktza. Some blank paper, some say is Muktza, but I think we discussed that. But if you have something Muktza sitting down on top of papers, right? So now those papers are not Muktza, and the Muktza, let's say it was a cell phone, is on top of the paper. So can you move the papers once the cell phone goes off the papers? So there you would be able to, because the papers are not serving the Muktza. The Muktza is actually serving the papers. The Muktza is on top of the papers for the paper's sake. Normally on a basis, the table is holding on to the leichter for the leichter's sake. Here, it's the Muktza working for the non-Muktza's sake, so therefore that's not a problem either. And also, then another requirement is that it has to be there the entire Bein HaShmashos, which means basically from Shkia till approximately 40 minutes after Shkia, it has to be on there. But let's say somebody lit the candles, and then 10 minutes later, let's say a non-Jew comes along and takes it off the table. Since it was not there the entire Bein HaShmashos, then it's not going to be, it's not going to make it Muktza. So again, it has to be there the entire Bein HaShmashos. Okay, so that's basically Basis L'Davar Asar. If you have this, then you cannot move the table. Okay, it can happen by simchas. You know, sometimes you make a simcha, and then Friday night, a lot of people come and they light the candles on the table, and then you want to move the table the next day. So then you would not be able to do it. You would not be able to do it. We'll get to how you are allowed to do it in a couple of minutes. But theoretically, if you just put candles on the table, then it would not work, and you would not be able to move the table. Same thing with the tray that you put the candles on, that also wouldn't work. Okay, so some examples of when this could be a problem is drawers. Okay, drawers that are in a let's say kitchen cabinets, or drawers under tables, or drawers under desks. Okay, so if you have Muktza in those drawers, then you are not allowed to open that drawer, because that drawer is holding on to Muktza. And even if you're going to end up be moving the Muktza anyways, which is not allowed. But even if theoretically the Muktza was removed from the drawer, that drawer is going to remain Muktza for the entire Shabbos. Okay, so again, if you're sure, if you know which drawers in your kitchen have Muktza in them, then then you would not be allowed to open that drawer. A chumrah that's out there is, what about, we said raw meat and food that's not edible on Shabbos is muktza. So what happens if you have that on your refrigerator door or on your freezer door, depending on what type of freezer you have? Let's say you have raw meat on your freezer door. Can you now go into your freezer on Shabbos? Because by moving the door, you're moving the muktza, right? And the muktza is, and then even if the meat, let's say, falls off the door would still be a problem, right? So can you do that? So the poskim say, push comes to shove, you would be allowed to open the door. But lechatchila, you should not rely on this leniency. So if you know that you have raw meat, it's preferable not to keep it on your freezer door. I don't think you'd keep raw meat on a refrigerator door. Or if you have any, I don't know, I can't think of any examples of something that would be in a refrigerator that would be muktza on Shabbos. Maybe medication, right? Then maybe that would be an issue. So, but whatever it is, if you know that the muktza is on the door, then take it off the door from before Shabbos. And then you don't have an issue. But if you forgot, then it's no problem. You're allowed to open the door. Another example is if you have raw meat in the freezer sitting on top of other foods that are not muktza. So you have a frozen cake, and then there's meat on top of that cake. And so then that's going to that cake holding up the meat may just make the cake muktza. But again, that would only be, right? That would only be if you purposely had the meat sitting on top of the cake. If it just happened to have been sitting on top of the cake, then it's not going to be a problem. And therefore it's going to be okay, which I think is usually the case. I don't think anybody purposely keeps meat on top of cake or on top of anything else in the freezer. But if that's the case, then try and remember before Shabbos. If not, you just slide it out. So somebody said raw eggs on a refrigerator door. That's actually pretty common. Okay, so raw eggs is actually debatable whether it's really muktza, because there are people that eat raw eggs. So I would say for this chumrah, you do not have to remove the raw eggs off the door of your refrigerator. But other muktza, yeah. Again, because that's using a combination of things that really raw eggs can theoretically be eaten by some people. Okay, so fine. So that'll be that. Let's hold on and see a couple of questions here. Okay, so also somebody asked about, so yes, you are allowed to tell your cleaning help that you're giving a little extra for the holidays. Yes, you can, just don't do it on the actual holiday itself. So do it a few days before. Okay, so barley on the freezer door, yeah, that would be muktza. Or yeast on the freezer door, yes, those both would be muktza. But we're going to get to the next step. The next stage is we're going to do in a minute, which will show that most of the time those are not going to be a problem, but for a different reason, which we'll get to. Right? Okay, so another question is a drawer that has benches in it, but also has Havdalah things. Right. Okay, so we'll get yes, we're going to get to that, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, so that's the next question also about if it holds both. Okay, so that's all if it holds. We'll get to this right now, and then hopefully we'll answer all the questions. That's all if the drawer or the wall or the door or the table, whatever it is exclusive to muktza, right? But what happens if it has both? Okay, what happens if it has both? So that's called basis l'davra asar or l'davra mutter. We started discussing it last week at the end of the shir, and then I ran out of time. So now hopefully we'll get it clearer. So basically, and this is much more common, this is where you have both muktza and non-muktza items on the table. Let's say on the table or on the door to the refrigerator or the door to the freezer or in your drawers, right? So now the basic equation is fairly straightforward. Whatever is worth more to you, whatever is worth more to you will win, right? So basically you have Muktza competing against non-Muktza. So using some of the examples there, you have barley on the door of the refrigerator or yeast. You also have cheese, that's expensive cheese, let's say, that's worth more than the barley yeast. The cheese is obviously not Muktza. Or milk, I guess, depending if your milk is Chal Yisrael or not, that would be whether it's expensive. maybe that's a different subject or different share. But yeah, so if let's say it's Chal Yisrael milk, so it's much more money, or Chal Yisrael cheese, so it's much more money. So if that's worth more, then we go with what's worth more. So therefore, it would be considered mutter. It would be considered mutter to move that item. Now you're going to say, oh, but you're still moving the muktza. You're still moving the muktza, but the muktza is being moved from the side. But we'll get back to that, how to move it. But the bottom line is that if you have something that's a base for something muktza and non-muktza, whatever is the more expensive is what's going to take on the status. So therefore, if in your drawers in your kitchen, you have pens and pencils and various other junk, which is pretty much common to every kitchen, and you also have something in there like sidurim, or which are usually worth more money, then that drawer is not going to be muktza. Right? The only problem is that you're still moving the pencils and the pens. Right? So again, we'll get back to that in a minute. So the same thing with the drawer. The drawer and with the what were the other questions? Right, so muksa, non-muksa items, right? So the barley. Oh yeah, so we addressed it. So basically, I will use whatever examples you want to use. But basically, if it's muksa, non-muksa, so then it's not going to get the status. The obvious example of this is the dining room table where you put on the candles, right? So usually, or if not usual, then make sure you do this, is that if you have the table set for Shabbos, so then even though, I'm jumping the gun. I'm sorry. Let's take a step back. Let's say you have disposable, what do you call it, like tea lights. So using tea lights, that is simply using tea lights. So then if you put something on that table, like you set the table, then obviously what you're setting the table with is going to be worth more than your tea lights. So therefore your table will not be muksa. And therefore it would be able to be moved after the muksa is removed, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, how exactly you remove the muksa, right? So it's basically whatever's more expensive that's on the table, that works. That works to make it that it's no longer, the table is no longer muksa. The problem is that a lot of times when people put their silver candelabra on the table, that's worth more than everything else on the table. So for this, we have, I guess it would be called a religious exemption, which is basically if there's something on the table which is choshev to you, either because Shabbos, well, really, it's really for Shabbos. If it's something choshev to you for Shabbos, like wine or challah or kiddush cup or something like that, then that's considered choshev to you for Shabbos, and therefore it has more chashivas. It has more chashivas to you than even the candelabra, even though it's worth way more than your challah. So therefore, anything that you put the covered Shabbos on the table, then that works. So that would work even if it's cheaper. So again, your dining room table where you would have challah or these type of things on top of the table, so then that would take priority, and therefore the table would not be muksa. The question is, I said before, a siddur. So the question is a siddur which is not necessary for Shabbos, but it's tam a siddur or tehillim or anything like that. So then it's not. The question is that considered more chashuv or not? Meaning something that's l'kavod Shabbos that you need for Shabbos for sure is considered more chashuv. If it's not l'kavod Shabbos, but it's something for Yiddishkeit, is that considered more chashuv? Basically, it's a machlokes, but we can rely on the shittas that say that you can consider that more chashuv. So if you put a siddur on the table, then that would work. Okay, so I'm not sure what the question is, but then the tea lights get chashivas. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Oh, so then okay, and then a drawer with clothing and an envelope of money. It would depend on is how much your clothing is worth. Is it worth more to you than the money? If the money is worth more than the clothing, then yeah, you cannot go into that drawer on Shabbos because that drawer is going to be Muktza. Now, let's say you do have it. Now, I don't know if this is what you remember the question with the tea lights get chashivas, but I mean, because that's what you mean, that the tea lights get chashivas because it's the covered Shabbos. Yes, that's true, but so is the candelabra. But as long as there's something mutter, that not mutter, but something that you need for Shabbos, for a mitzvah, then that's going to take over the chashivas. The problem is that you're still moving muktza, right? If you have the tea lights left on the table, that's still muktza. So how do you move the table? You're moving muktza. So basically, there's a few things that you can do to try and get rid of the muktza. It doesn't really work well with a drawer. So basically, if you know that you're going to be using a drawer on Shabbos, lichatchila, you should remove the muktza, right? Yes, putting a piece of jewelry in the drawer that's more expensive than the money, that will make it not muktza. But the problem is that you're still moving the money. You're still moving the money, which you're not lichatchila supposed to do. So basically, for drawers, these next eitzes will not exactly work, but it can work for a table, right? So basically, what you have to try and do is, let's use the example of the table, and you have a candelabra. So a candelabra, what you're supposed to do is try and knock the muktza off the table, and then you can move the table. So a candelabra, obviously, you're not going to knock it off the table because you're going to ruin your candelabra. So then that doesn't work unless you have, let's say, very soft carpeting. You know for sure it's not going to get ruined. So then what you're supposed to do is knock the table, like shake it until the candelabra falls to the floor, and then your table will not be muktza. Again, that's assuming you had something else on the table. If there was nothing else on the table, then there's nothing you could do. That table is muktza for Shabbos. Again, a table is allowed to be touched, right? Muktza is allowed to be touched. A very important rule that people forget, and we should probably reiterate that every week. Muktza is allowed to be touched. It just can't be moved. So you have muktza on the table, you're allowed to still touch the table and use the table. You're just not allowed to move the table, right? So again, if you have this muktza that's on the table together with something that's not muktza, and the not muktza is more chashuv, so therefore your table is not muktza, but you want to be able to move it, but you can't move it when the muktza is on it. So what you should try and do is knock off the muktza, okay? If you can't knock off the muktza, right, then you can then move it to some place where you can knock off the muktza, and then that would be okay. Again, I don't know exactly what the scenario would be. In the Gemara scenario, in the Shulchan Aruch scenario, is if somebody has a barrel of wine and there's a rock on top of the barrel of wine, so they want to be able to lift up the wine. So the first option the Gemara says to do is tilt the barrel so that the rock falls off. But what happens if that barrel is next to a bunch of other barrels, and if the rock falls off, it's going to smash the barrels next to it, so that won't work. So then you can lift up the barrel, move it away from the other barrels, and then tilt off the rock. That would be the second. Option. And then if you can't do either one of these, like with the table, then again, let's be clear. If you have a candelabra on the table, you're not going to be able to knock it off because it's going to get ruined. And maybe you can move it to carpeting, and there you can knock it off. Okay, maybe, right? Maybe that would work. Probably not. I can't imagine doing it, but people are going to do that. So then you're basically stuck with moving the table not in the regular way. Let's say pushing it with your feet, or turning around and pushing it with your back, or the back of your arms, pushing it in a different way, which I hope Bez Hashem to discuss next week, because we haven't discussed this yet. Which is we said many times that all muktza could be moved if you move it properly in the right way. it's not lechatchila to move it, but if necessary, all muktzah can be moved if you do it properly, which hopefully Bez Hashem next week we'll discuss. So the worst comes to worst. If you have the table that needs to be moved, then you can move it with your feet, move it with the back of your arms, or that type of thing. You always have that to rely on. But I don't see how that's going to work for a drawer that has muktza in it. Right? So a drawer that has muktza in it, I would say, and you need to get into that drawer, you should move it differently than you normally move it. So but again, that Bez Hashem next week we'll discuss. If you have a buffet, that's an excellent question. You have a buffet table. This is very common. Thank you for reminding me about that. You have a buffet table that has candle, that you light the candles on the buffet. And then there's a drawer in the buffet that has the cutlery in it, right? So is that a problem to open the drawer? So basically, the halacha differentiates between whether that drawer is removable or not, right? So then, if it's removable, then it would be considered. I'm sorry, I'm saying something else. If it's on top and the drawers are, I apologize. I mixed up with a different scenario, which maybe I'll discuss in a minute. But if the drawer is a separate entity, then that's not considered part of your buffet, which I think most drawers are. Right, it's a separate entity, and therefore it's not. You're not really moving anything. Meaning the buffet is a table, and then you have a separate drawer. Most drawers are separate, so therefore you'd be able to go into the drawer. But yeah, I don't know what case there would be. If you have a desk, you wanted to move the desk. No, so the case I'm talking about the other way would be, let's say you have muktza in the drawer of your buffet, right? So then would you be able to move the buffet? So that would depend on whether the drawer is removable, right? If it's removable, so then it would be considered muktza. If it's not removable, then it would not be considered. It would not be considered muktza. Okay, but that's not such a common case. Was there another question there? Sorry, I'm just trying to admit people and answer questions. Also, flowers on a Shabbos table. So that's also a good question, and I'm glad it was asked because flowers are not muktza. Contrary to popular belief, you could shout it from the rooftops. Flowers in a vase are not muktza. You can move them wherever you want, whenever you want. It's not a problem. I'll say even a bigger chiddush, that if the flowers for some reason come out of the vase, you're even allowed to put them back into the vase, right? Meaning somebody comes along, if for whatever reason takes out the flowers, as long as the bulbs, I think the bulbs, that's what it's called, as long as they're already, I'm too tired to think of the word, but meaning the flowers are already not sprouted, right? I imagine you know what I'm saying. Meaning basically, if they're closed, then you would not be able to put it back. Bloomed. Think, okay, that's bloomed. So if they're fully bloomed, then you could put them even back into the water. If they're not bloomed yet, then you would not be able to put them back into the water, right? And orchid or a plant is a little bit more complicated, but the bottom line is a plant would be able, or an orchid for sure, can be moved on and off the table with no problem on Shabbos. It's this interesting psak is that so if flowers fall out of the vase, you're allowed to put them into the original water. But usually what happens is the water spills, and now you have, what's the point of putting it back into the vase? There's no water left in the vase. So can you just go to the sink and fill it up with water? Like, what's the big deal? Why not? What should be the difference between doing that and putting it back into water that existed? So this is where Hilchos Shabbos gets so good. There's such a fine line where things could be confused. Again, what's the difference if I put the flowers back into the water on Shabbos, the water that was there from before Shabbos, or if I go to the sink and fill it up. The truth is, in halacha, there is no difference. But the Chachamim said, since back then it was a tircha, hundreds of years ago, you didn't have a sink that you just filled up with water. It would be a tircha to go get more water. So the Chachamim said, do not go get more water to put flowers, which obviously would not apply nowadays. But still, like we know, the gezerah is stuck. So therefore, if your vase, the water spills out of the vase, then you are not allowed to fill up the vase with water. If there's still water left in the vase, then again, if the flowers are bloomed, then you're allowed to put them back into the water. I saw one of the big poskim nowadays gave an eitzah and said you can fill up the vase with seltzer, because seltzer is not something that you normally would put in flowers, and it's not a tircha. It doesn't go under the category of water that the Chachamim said. So therefore, you can put the flowers back into seltzer. I take no responsibility for whether seltzer kills flowers or not. I don't know, but that's one of the eights. Fine. Okay, so that's basically that. So a question here is a junk drawer that has pens and rubber bands. They're both not valuable. Right. So the problem is that it's the pen. I don't know. You have to decide which one, the pens or the rubber bands, which ones are more chashuv. If the pens are more chashuv than the rubber bands, then you would not be able to go into that drawer. If the rubber bands are more chashuv, then you would be able to go in. But again, it's not lechatchila, because the whole drawer, you're moving muktza, because you are moving the pens, right? So, right. So getting the money out of the drawer, I have no idea how you get money out of the drawer on Shabbos. So it would be a problem. So then in that case, like we said, if you're stuck with muktza and non-muktza in the drawer, so then you move it with a shinui like you do with any other muktza that you have to move, which again, Be'ez Hashem will do next week, and that's how you move the muktza. So again, another common case is if you leave money, right? If you leave money in your pocket, I don't know if this applies so much to women, but it happens a lot. It almost happened to me this Shabbos, actually. I had a check in my pocket from chasana. Somebody gave me a check for tzedakah, and I had it in my pocket right before Shabbos. And then Baruch Hashem, I remembered that I had this check, which is muktza, in my pocket right before Shabbos. So Baruch Hashem, I removed it. But had I remembered on Shabbos, which has happened many times, so now what? My jacket, and I want the money in the jacket, right? We said one of the requirements is that you have to keep the muktza, you have to want the muktza there, right? So I wanted the muktza in my pocket. So therefore, the chayra, the question is my whole jacket muktza now? So it depends what type of pocket. I think we mentioned this quickly last week. It really would depend on what type of pocket. See, if you have like a shirt pocket or a lot of kids' pants, the pocket is not an independent hanging pocket. It's part of the shirt. Like a men's shirt pocket is usually one end of the pocket is the shirt, and then they just put an extra fabric, and that creates a pocket. So if that's the case, the shirt is really muktza because it was meant to hold muktza. If it's a pocket like a regular standard pants pocket, where the pocket is an individual pocket that happens to be sewn onto pants, then we're going to say that the pants or the jacket is not muktza, but the pocket would be muktza. Right, so you would not be able to move things in the pocket. So that could be also a fairly common case. Now, what the din is if you're walking in the street and you feel money in your pocket, so there the price can say you're not mechuyev to drop the money, right? I mean, obviously you can't go into the pocket and take out the money. What you do is you pull the pocket inside out, and then you let the money fall to the floor. But you would not be mechuyev to do it right there in the street. You could wait until you get to a private property or someplace that it would be relatively safe, and then that would be allowed. Okay, I think that would be it for that subject. Okay, let me see. And if anybody else has any questions, if you could please post it now. Also, a bookcase. So again, you can use, even if the bookcase is Muktza, you're allowed to use the bookcase. You're just not allowed to move it. I would imagine you're not going to move a bookcase on Shabbos, but theoretically, if you have something expensive on the bookcase, so it depends what type of books. If it's non-Jewish books, then those don't have a chashivas. But like we said, if you have Sidurim, Chumoshim, whatever, Svarim, that order gets an automatic chashivas over even something that's very expensive, and therefore you would theoretically be allowed to, let's say something fell behind the bookcase, even if there's Muktza that's on the bookcase, you would be able to move it, but you'd have to move it with some sort of shinui, because again, when the Muktza is on there, you're moving Muktza. So again, let me just review before I sign off. There's something called Basis L'Davar also, which is basically that the table retains, like using an example of a table, retains the Muktza status even after the Muktza gets removed. When the Muktza is on there, then of course you can't move the table because then you're moving the Muktza. So then we said you should try and knock it off. If you can't knock it off, then move it with the shinui, right? But sometimes you have things that are Muktza, there are Muktza items on there and non-Muktza items on there. So then that would get the status of whichever is worth more money. Unless it's something for Shabbos or something for religious purposes, then that gets the chashivas, and therefore you would be allowed to move it, but only after the Muktza is removed, which we said is a problem for drawers, like junk drawers as they call them, right? So those junk drawers, you really lechatchila should make sure whatever you're going to need from there is not there on Shabbos, because you can't really knock things out of a junk drawer. So that's basically that. Oh, so there's one example, and this does apply to many people, especially those with newer houses, that have the drawers where you have the garbage can in the drawer, under the counter garbage can, and you pull it. So that drawer, many poskim say is Muktza, because garbage is Muktza. So when you're pulling out the drawer, even though you may or may not be moving Muktza, but even if you're just moving the drawer, since the drawer is holding the garbage, then even if the garbage was removed, you have a problem. So the eitzah to not have this issue is to keep a garbage bag that you haven't used, right? You haven't used a garbage bag, or I know a friend of mine that keeps a can of tuna there. So that can of tuna is always going to be worth more than the garbage, and therefore you'd be allowed to open that drawer even when there's no garbage there. Okay, so that's an interesting chumrah, but there are makilim, so it's not. Don't anybody get stressed out about that, because there's a question here. Yeah, so if you have Muktza on top of a buffet or a dresser, right? So yeah, so then the drawer is considered a separate entity, and that you'd be allowed to move. Right, the drawers you can move, not the dresser. The dresser you can't move. The drawers you can move, right? Yeah. So now, I hope that's clear. So again, the drawers are considered separate entities from the desk. You can't move the desk or the dresser or whatever it is, because the dresser itself would be Muktza. So if you discover Muktza in your pocket and Rishus Harabim. So anytime, and this is a lost science, because many people live where there's Erevin, so it's really a lost science. But if you're stuck when you're walking in a public property with something in your hand, something in your pocket, so the halacha is that you continue walking, you don't stop, and you continue walking until you can either put the item down. This applies to Muktza and non-Muktza items, right? Like a tissue would be the most common example. So you'd keep walking, and then without stopping, try to put it down on something like a mailbox, or if not, just continue walking till you're in a private property, and then take it off there. But you should not stop walking. No stopping to walk. No, and then And also certainly don't put it down, because the problem is that it means you took something Rosh Hashanah and you picked it up, or it was in your pocket, which is the equivalent of picking it up, and then you stopped, and then that's like putting it down. So if you keep moving, then it's a derabanan, which obviously we don't want you to do lechatchila, but you can do that. But you keep walking, and then you'll be okay. What else? Are store receipts muktza? If you're saving the store receipts because you need it for tax purposes, or you're going to plan on doing a return or something like that, yes, then I would say store receipts are muktza. So just off topic. Walking in place by a traffic light is, you got to keep moving. You got to, like those people doing exercise. You standing in one place is I think is considered stopping. You got to keep walking. You just keep moving. When you buy a traffic light, or you're waiting for the light to change, just keep walking in a circle. I think even if your feet are moving because you're in one place, but I can't say that for sure. I'd have to look that up. I think as long as you're standing in one place, that's called stopping. Okay, so garbage bags, the perforated garbage bags, separating them, you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Same thing with tissues. Same thing with freeze pops that they come like in how do you call it? Like a bunch connected together. Those are not supposed to be detached on Shabbos. Contact lens cases also should not be. I'm just trying to think of examples. So if a garbage bag is on a roll and they're connected to each other, you cannot take those off on Shabbos. Same thing again with tissues in a tissue box. However, that doesn't mean that a lot of garbage bags, when you open the garbage bag, you can tell that they were connected to each other. So that really depends on how they made the garbage bags. If they purposely kept them together so it should be neat, then you would not be able to open those garbage bags. But from what I understand, most of these garbage bags, it's the way they cut them, so there's heat from the machine, because the machine moving creates heat, melts down the garbage bags a little bit, and that connects them to each other. Then that would not be a problem. Meaning it's only if they do it on purpose, and that when they do it on purpose, and then when you open the bag, you're creating a new utensil that wasn't there before. If it wasn't done on purpose, and it just happens to be that the bags are connected, then it's no problem. For example, if you got a brand new book or sefer, so a lot of times the papers are connected to each other. If they were connected from the factory, you are not allowed to separate those papers. But if you were eating food last Shabbos over your book, and the food connected the pages, then you would be allowed to. It's only when you're creating something new that wasn't there before that's a problem. If you're returning something, is the receipt worth the amount? You mean you're talking about if it's the receipts in a drawer and other things? I don't know. That's a good question. I'm assuming that's what your question is. If you have receipts in a drawer plus, that's muktza, but at what value is that receipt? It could be that it would take on the value of what it is that you're trying to return, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that is. Oh, can cheese sticks be separated? That's what that means. Can cheese sticks be those are plastics on cheese sticks? Yeah, those should not be separated. Same thing with those yogurts that come like 4. Again, I'm not saying they are makilim, but one should try lechatchila to separate them before Shabbos, because it's meant to come like that in the fact to keep everything neat in the factory, and then you're meant to take them off. So you're sort of separating, and it could be mechatech issue, which is because you're cutting something down to proper size. Okay, so I guess we will stop here. Oh, we went over time. Fine. I wish everybody a good tvach and a good yar, and Bez Hashem next week 9:00. Okay, Hatzlacha. There's one other question. Okay, oh yeah, fine. Okay, Hatzlacha and a good tvach.